In the remote mining town of Copperdale, nestled deep in the Yukon Territory of Canada, the harsh landscape mirrored the rugged lives of its inhabitants. The town, with its population of just over 5,000, was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or so they thought. Unbeknownst to most, a forbidden romance was blossoming behind closed doors, one that would ultimately lead to tragedy and shake the very foundations of this tight-knit community. Copperdale was a town built on silver and dreams. Founded in the late 19th century during the Klondike Gold Rush, it had weathered boom and bust cycles, evolving from a lawless frontier outpost to a stable, if isolated, modern community. The Copperdale Silver Mine, the town's economic lifeline, loomed large on the outskirts, its industrial silhouette a stark contrast to the breathtaking wilderness that surrounded the town. At the center of this tale were Jack Thornton, a 42-year-old mining engineer, and his 19-year-old stepdaughter, Olivia Reed. Jack had married Olivia's mother, Sarah, 3 years prior, bringing stability to what had been a tumultuous life for the mother and daughter. Sarah, a nurse at the local clinic, had struggled as a single parent since Olivia was a toddler, and Jack's arrival seemed like a godsend. Jack was well respected in Copperdale, known for his innovative approaches to mining safety and his generous contributions to community projects. With his salt and pepper hair and piercing blue eyes, he cut an impressive figure. Many of the town's single women had set their sights on him before his marriage to Sarah. Jack had moved to Copperdale 5 years ago, leaving behind a failed marriage and a high-stress job in Toronto. The Yukon had offered him a fresh start, a chance to rebuild his life away from the pressures of big city living. Olivia, on the other hand, was a free spirit. Her long, fiery red hair and emerald eyes made her stand out in the small town. She had a passion for photography and dreamed of escaping Copperdale to pursue a career in the big city. But for now, she was stuck, working part-time at the local diner to save money for college. Olivia had grown up in Copperdale, and while she appreciated the tight-knit community, she felt suffocated by its limitations. Her camera was her escape, allowing her to capture the raw beauty of the Yukon landscape and dream of far-off places. Sarah, at 40, was a cornerstone of the community. As one of the few nurses at the Copperdale Medical Clinic, she was known for her compassion and tireless work ethic. She had moved to Copperdale fresh out of nursing school, falling in love with the rugged beauty of the Yukon when she became pregnant with Olivia. The father, a seasonal worker at the mine, had long since moved on. Sarah had raised her daughter alone, relying on the support of the close-knit community. The affair began innocently enough. With Sarah often working night shifts at the clinic, Jack and Olivia found themselves spending more time alone together. At first, it was just casual conversations over dinner, but soon they discovered a shared love for old films and began having movie nights. Jack introduced Olivia to classics like Casablanca and Rear Window, while Olivia shared her passion for modern indie films. As the long, dark Yukon winter settled in, the line between familial affection and something more began to blur. Jack found himself captivated by Olivia's youthful energy and creativity, while Olivia was drawn to Jack's maturity and worldliness. One snowy evening, as they sat close on the couch watching Casablanca, their eyes met, and the tension that had been building for months finally broke. Their first kiss was electric, forbidden, and addictive. From that moment, Jack and Olivia's relationship spiraled into a passionate affair. They stole moments whenever they could, hurried encounters when Sarah was at work, secret meetings in Jack's office at the mine under the guise of Olivia bringing him lunch. The thrill of their forbidden love was intoxicating, making them reckless and careless. The secret weighed heavily on both of them. Jack struggled with guilt, knowing he was betraying Sarah's trust and taking advantage of his position as Olivia's stepfather. Olivia, while exhilarated by the romance, felt torn between her feelings for Jack and her love for her mother. Both rationalized their behavior, convincing themselves that their love was special, transcending societal norms and family bonds. As winter gave way to spring, their secret became harder to keep. Olivia's best friend, Megan, noticed changes in her behavior, the secretive smiles, the sudden unavailability, the new glow about her. Jack's colleagues at the mine commented on his distraction, his sudden propensity for taking long lunch breaks. Megan, concerned for her friend, tried to pry information from Olivia. "You've been acting weird lately. Liv, is there a new guy? Come on, spill." But Olivia deflected, making up stories about a long-distance relationship with a boy she'd met online. The lies weighed on her, straining her closest friendship. At the mine, Jack's work began to suffer. He missed important safety meetings and made careless errors in his calculations. His friend and colleague, Tom, confronted him one day after a near-miss incident in the mine shaft. "Jack, what's going on with you? You've got your head in the clouds, and it's putting people at risk." Jack brushed off the concerns, blaming stress and lack of sleep, but internally, he knew he was losing control. Sarah, too, began to sense that something was amiss. She noticed the lingering glances between her husband and daughter, the sudden tension when she entered a room. But she pushed her suspicions aside, unable to fathom the betrayal that was occurring under her own roof. She threw herself into her work at the clinic, taking on extra shifts and volunteering for community health initiatives, anything to distract herself from the growing unease at home. The situation came to a head on a warm June evening. Sarah had switched shifts with a colleague and returned home unexpectedly. As she walked through the front door, she heard muffled sounds coming from upstairs. Following the noise, she opened the door to the master bedroom and found Jack and Olivia in a passionate embrace. The scene that unfolded was one of unrestrained fury and anguish. Sarah's agonized screams echoed through the house as she hurled accusations and obscenities at Jack and Olivia. Neighbors would later report hearing the commotion from down the street. In the heat of the moment, Jack made a fateful decision that would alter all of their lives forever. Desperate to silence Sarah and protect their secret, he grabbed a heavy brass lamp from the nightstand and brought it down on her head with crushing force. Sarah crumpled to the floor, blood pooling beneath her. Jack and Olivia stood frozen in horror, the magnitude of what had just occurred slowly sinking in. In the frantic minutes that followed, they tried to decide what to do: call an ambulance, flee the scene. In the end, panic and self-preservation won out. They hastily cleaned up the worst of the blood, wrapped Sarah's body in a bedsheet, and carried her to Jack's truck. As dusk fell, they drove to an abandoned mine shaft on the outskirts of town and dumped her body. The drive to the abandoned mine was tense and silent. Jack gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, his mind racing with the enormity of what they had done. Olivia sat beside him, her face pale and tear-stained, occasionally glancing at the bundle in the back of the truck that had once been her mother. The abandoned Silver Creek mine had been closed for decades, its tunnels deemed too unstable for further exploration. As they pulled up to the mine entrance, the setting sun cast long shadows across the desolate landscape. Jack and Olivia worked quickly, carrying Sarah's body deep into the mine shaft. The darkness seemed to swallow them whole as they ventured further in, the only sound their labored breathing and the occasional drip of water from the cave ceiling. They laid Sarah's body in a remote corner of the mine, covering it with loose rocks and debris. As they worked, the reality of their actions began to sink in. Olivia broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. Jack, his face a mask of grim determination, pulled her close. "We can never speak of this," he whispered hoarsely. "Never." The next morning, Jack reported Sarah missing to the police. He claimed she had never returned home from her shift at the clinic. A frantic search ensued, with volunteers combing the area while Sarah's face was plastered across local news stations. Jack played the part of the distraught husband, with Olivia by his side as the grieving stepdaughter. But their performances couldn't fully mask the guilt and fear that gnawed at them both. As days stretched into weeks with no sign of Sarah, suspicion began to fall on Jack. Sergeant Elena Koskinen of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police sensed that something was off about his story from the beginning. Her instincts, honed by years of service in remote northern communities, told her that there was more to this disappearance than met the eye. Koskinen, a tall, no-nonsense woman in her late 40s, had transferred to Copperdale 2 years ago after a distinguished career in larger cities. She had initially found the slower pace of small-town policing frustrating, but now she was fully engaged, determined to uncover the truth behind Sarah's disappearance. As she delved deeper into the investigation, Koskinen began to notice discrepancies in Jack's story. His timeline didn't quite add up, and his concern for his missing wife seemed forced. She also picked up on an odd tension between Jack and Olivia, fleeting glances and an almost palpable discomfort when they were near each other. Meanwhile, Jack and Olivia's secret affair continued, now tinged with desperation and dread. The knowledge of what they had done hung over them like a dark cloud. They clung to each other, bound by their shared crime, but the stress began to take its toll. Jack started drinking heavily, often showing up to work with bloodshot eyes and trembling hands. Olivia's behavior grew erratic. She skipped shifts at the diner and lashed out at friends who expressed concern. Their passionate romance devolved into codependency fueled by fear and guilt. Late at night, they would lie awake, jumping at every sound, convinced that at any moment the police would burst through the door. They rehearsed their stories obsessively, going over every detail to ensure their accounts matched. As the investigation intensified, cracks in their story began to emerge. A neighbor reported hearing a woman's scream coming from the Thornton house on the evening Sarah disappeared. Jack's cell phone records showed he had turned his phone off for several hours that night, highly unusual for a man who was always on call for mining emergencies. And Olivia's friends noted that she had abruptly withdrawn from all social activities, which seemed strange for a girl who had always been the life of the party. Sergeant Koskinen methodically built her case, piecing together evidence and witness statements. She interviewed Sarah's colleagues at the clinic, confirming that Sarah had indeed left work at the end of her shift on the night she disappeared. A thorough search of the town and surrounding wilderness had turned up no trace of the missing woman. Koskinen's suspicions crystallized when forensic analysis of Jack's truck turned up traces of blood in the cargo area, despite his claim that he hadn't used the vehicle that day. The sergeant knew she needed more, and she was determined to get it. Armed with a search warrant, police scoured the Thornton home and made a grisly discovery. Although the master bedroom had been scrubbed clean, luminol revealed large bloodstains on the carpet and wall. The sight of the glowing blue stains, stark evidence of violence, sent a chill through even the most hardened officers on the scene. Confronted with the mounting evidence, Jack's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. During a tense interrogation, he broke down and confessed to killing Sarah in a moment of rage, but he insisted it was an accident and that Olivia had no involvement. He claimed sole responsibility for disposing of the body. Olivia, however, couldn't maintain the lie. Racked with guilt and facing intense questioning from Sergeant Koskinen, she eventually admitted her role in the affair and the cover-up of Sarah's death. The full, sordid story came pouring out: their months-long relationship, the confrontation with Sarah, the panicked decision to hide the body. The revelations sent shockwaves through Copperdale. The scandalous affair between stepfather and stepdaughter, culminating in murder, became the subject of lurid headlines and gossip. The community reeled as the image of the respected mining engineer and the innocent small-town girl was shattered. News of the confession spread through Copperdale like wildfire. Residents gathered in shocked groups on street corners and in the local diner, trying to make sense of the tragedy that had unfolded in their midst. Many expressed disbelief, unable to reconcile the Jack and Olivia they thought they knew with the horrific acts they had committed. Sarah's colleagues at the clinic were particularly devastated. They had held out hope for weeks that their friend and co-worker would be found alive. Now, faced with the brutal truth, they struggled to cope with their grief and anger. The clinic set up a memorial in Sarah's honor, a quiet space where patients and staff could pay their respects. At the Copperdale silver mine, production ground to a halt as workers tried to process the news that their respected chief engineer was a murderer. Many felt betrayed, questioning how they could have worked alongside Jack for years without suspecting the darkness that lurked beneath his professional demeanor. The arrest of Jack and Olivia left a void in the community. The Thornton house, once a warm and welcoming place, stood empty and forlorn. Neighbors drew their curtains against the sight, unable to look at the place where such a heinous act had occurred. As the case progressed towards trial, Copperdale became the focus of national media attention. Journalists descended on the small town, their satellite trucks and camera crews an incongruous sight on the quiet streets. Many residents resented the intrusion, feeling that their community's tragedy was being turned into a spectacle for the rest of the country. The trial that followed was the biggest event in Copperdale's history. The small courthouse, more accustomed to dealing with minor infractions and property disputes, was ill-equipped to handle the high-profile case. Additional security measures were put in place, and a lottery system was implemented for the limited public seating. Each day, crowds gathered outside the courthouse, braving the Yukon weather to catch a glimpse of Jack and Olivia as they were led in and out. The community was divided, with some expressing sympathy for Olivia, viewing her as a victim of Jack's manipulation, while others condemned them both equally. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution painted a damning picture of Jack as a predator who had seduced his young stepdaughter and then murdered his wife to cover up their affair. They presented evidence of the long-standing nature of the relationship, including text messages and emails exchanged between Jack and Olivia that left little doubt about the nature of their involvement. Olivia was portrayed as a naive victim of Jack's manipulation, but also as a willing participant in the cover-up. The prosecution argued that while she may not have struck the fatal blow, her actions in the aftermath of Sarah's death made her equally culpable. Jack's defense team tried to argue for a charge of manslaughter, claiming that Sarah's death was an unintended result of a heated argument. They pointed to Jack's years of community service and his reputation as a safety-conscious engineer to paint him as a man of good character who had made a terrible mistake in a moment of passion. But the evidence of premeditation in the disposal of the body and the subsequent lies told to police weakened this argument considerably. Olivia's lawyer pursued a strategy of emphasizing her youth and the psychological manipulation she had endured. Expert witnesses testified about the power dynamics in such relationships and the impact on a young person's decision-making abilities. The defense tried to portray Olivia as a troubled young woman who had been groomed by an authority figure, arguing that her actions were the result of trauma and coercion rather than malicious intent. As the trial progressed, more details of Jack and Olivia's relationship came to light, each revelation more shocking than the last. Former colleagues testified about Jack's increasingly erratic behavior in the months leading up to Sarah's death. Olivia's friends spoke of her withdrawal from social circles and her secretive behavior. One of the most dramatic moments of the trial came when Megan, Olivia's best friend, took the stand. Fighting back tears, she recounted conversations where Olivia had hinted at a secret relationship, though she had never imagined the truth. Megan's testimony painted a picture of a young woman caught between loyalty to her friend and the horror of what had transpired. The most damning testimony came from a geologist who had worked with Jack at the mine. He recounted a conversation just days before Sarah's disappearance, where Jack had casually mentioned the dangers of the abandoned Silver Creek mine, noting how easy it would be for someone to disappear in its maze-like tunnels. This seemingly innocuous comment now took on a sinister significance, suggesting that Jack had been planning Sarah's murder for some time. As the trial neared its conclusion, the impact on Copperdale was palpable. The once bustling Main Street was quieter, with many businesses suffering as residents stayed home, glued to their televisions for updates on the case. The school reported increased absences as children, picking up on their parents' stress and anxiety, complained of mysterious illnesses. The closing arguments were delivered to a packed courtroom. The prosecutor, a sharp-tongued woman from Whitehorse, delivered a scathing indictment of Jack and Olivia's actions. She emphasized the betrayal of trust, the calculated nature of the cover-up, and the devastating impact on the community. "This is not a story of star-crossed lovers," she declared, her voice ringing through the hushed courtroom. "This is a tale of manipulation, murder, and monstrous selfishness." Jack's defense attorney, in his closing statement, made a last-ditch appeal for leniency, highlighting Jack's previous good character and arguing that the murder was a tragic aberration in an otherwise exemplary life. He painted a picture of a man overtaken by passion and poor judgment, pleading for the jury to consider a lesser charge of manslaughter. Olivia's lawyer, in a moving final argument, portrayed his client as a victim in her own right. He spoke of the psychological impact of losing her father at a young age, the vulnerability that made her susceptible to Jack's advances, and the trauma of witnessing her mother's murder. While acknowledging that Olivia's actions in covering up the crime were wrong, he argued that she had been acting under duress and the overwhelming influence of her stepfather. After a trial that lasted 3 weeks, the jury retreated to deliberate. The town held its collective breath, waiting for a verdict that would determine not just the fate of Jack and Olivia, but in many ways, the future of Copperdale itself. 2 days later, the jury reached their decision. As the courtroom doors opened and people filed in for the verdict, the tension was palpable. Jack and Olivia were brought in separately, both looking pale and drawn after weeks in custody. The jury foreman, a retired school teacher, stood to deliver the verdict, her hand shaking slightly as she held the paper. "On the charge of second-degree murder, we find the defendant, Jack Thornton, guilty." A collective gasp went through the courtroom, followed by muffled sobs from Jack's family members in the gallery. For Olivia, the verdict was mixed. "On the charge of accessory after the fact to murder, we find the defendant, Olivia Reed, guilty." There was a pause before the foreman continued. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant not guilty." Olivia sagged in her seat, a complex mix of relief and despair washing over her face. The judge, a stern man with 4 decades on the bench, took a moment to gather his thoughts before delivering the sentences. He looked at Jack first, his eyes hard. "Jack Thornton, your actions have torn apart not just a family, but an entire community. You abused your position of trust in the most egregious way possible. I sentence you to life in prison, with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Turning to Olivia, the judge's expression softened slightly. "Olivia Reed, while I acknowledge the psychological factors at play in your case, you are not absolved of responsibility for your actions. You had multiple opportunities to come forward and chose not to. I sentence you to 7 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 1/3 of your sentence." As the sentences were read, a mix of emotions swept through the courtroom. Some felt justice had been served, while others thought the punishments too lenient or too harsh. Jack's face remained impassive as he was led away, but Olivia broke down, sobbing as she was escorted out. Outside the courthouse, the crowd that had gathered to hear the verdict erupted in a cacophony of reactions. Sarah's friends from the clinic hugged each other, crying tears of relief and grief. Jack's colleagues from the mine stood in shocked silence, still struggling to reconcile the man they knew with the monster revealed in court. In the days and weeks that followed, Copperdale grappled with the aftermath of the trial. The town, which had prided itself on its close-knit nature, now faced difficult questions about how such a tragedy could have occurred in their midst. Community meetings were held to discuss ways to heal and move forward, but the path ahead seemed uncertain. The Copperdale silver mine, already struggling with falling silver prices, took another hit as investors grew wary of the negative publicity surrounding the case. Layoffs followed, adding economic anxiety to the town's emotional turmoil. For those closest to the case, the impact was profound and lasting. Megan, Olivia's once best friend, left Copperdale shortly after the trial, unable to bear the constant reminders of her friend's betrayal. She enrolled in a college on the other side of the country, determined to start fresh. Sergeant Elena Koskinen, while commended for her work on the case, found herself haunted by the details of the investigation. The image of Sarah's body, recovered from the depths of the abandoned mine, visited her in nightmares. She threw herself into her work with renewed vigor, determined to prevent another such tragedy. Jack's ex-wife and their 2 children, who had followed the case from afar, were left to grapple with a new, terrible understanding of the man they thought they knew. His son, in particular, struggled with the legacy of his father's crimes, changing his last name and cutting all ties with his imprisoned parent. As for Jack and Olivia, their paths diverged dramatically. Jack was sent to a maximum security prison in Ontario, where he would spend at least the next 25 years of his life. Initial reports suggested he was struggling to adjust to life behind bars, the former respected professional now just another inmate. Olivia, given her age and the circumstances of her case, was placed in a medium security facility with a focus on rehabilitation. She enrolled in counseling and education programs, slowly coming to terms with the magnitude of her actions and the harm she had caused. 5 years into her sentence, Olivia was granted parole. She emerged from prison a changed woman, her youthful exuberance replaced by a somber maturity. She chose not to return to Copperdale, instead moving to Vancouver, where she could blend into the anonymity of the big city.